Most people picture a Wall Street thief in a tailored suit, not a college kid in a dorm room. The millions weren't stolen with a briefcase of cash or complex market manipulation. This isn't a story about insider trading, at least not in the way you'd expect. It begins with a simple, overlooked flaw in the system's brand new technology. Honestly, the banks and brokerage firms never saw him coming. He was just a 22-year-old computer science student named Stanley Mark Rifkin. His target wasn't a vault, but the electronic transfer system used by the biggest banks. You see, in the late 1970s, wire transfers were becoming the lifeblood of global finance. Money moved as digital codes over secure telephone lines. The Security Pacific National Bank in Los Angeles was a key player in this network. Rifkin learned this because he worked there, briefly, as a consultant. His job was to study their security procedures, not to exploit them. But what he saw was a staggering opportunity. The system's greatest strength was also its most profound weakness. How could a single person trick a billion-dollar institution? The answer was shockingly low-tech. Look, the security for moving millions wasn't some unbreakable cipher. It was a simple, spoken code, changed daily and given to authorized personnel. Rifkin just walked into the wire transfer room one day, like he belonged. He watched, he listened, and he memorized the code. He saw exactly how an operator would send money to any account in the world. Then he left, his plan already forming. He didn't need special equipment or a team of accomplices. All he needed was a payphone and a confident voice. But first, he needed a destination for the cash. Rifkin flew to New York and visited the Republic National Bank. He posed as a businessman from a large international corporation. He opened an account under a corporate alias, laying the groundwork. Then he returned to Los Angeles, ready to act. On a regular business day, he entered a Security Pacific Bank branch. He went to a public phone in the lobby, not a back office. He dialed the wire transfer department from inside the bank itself. He gave the correct daily code and identified himself as an authorized manager. He instructed them to wire over $10 million to his new Swiss account. The operator followed the procedure without a hint of suspicion. The money, exactly $10,200,000, was sent instantly. It traveled from Los Angeles to the Waschaud Handelsbank in Zurich. And just like that, it was gone from Security Pacific's ledger. Rifkin hung up the payphone and walked out of the bank. He didn't run, he just calmly left. The bank had no idea their money had just vanished into thin air. Can you imagine the audacity of that single phone call? The entire heist was over in minutes. Now he had to actually get his hands on the cash. He boarded an international flight to Switzerland. He walked into the Waschaud Bank and presented his credentials. He didn't want a wire transfer or a check that could be traced. He wanted something almost mythical for such a large sum: diamonds. He convinced the bank that converting the stolen millions into diamonds was a smart move for his corporation. The bank arranged for a reputable dealer to meet with him in Zurich. Rifkin examined a small fortune in high-quality, uncut diamonds. He selected a stunning collection worth the entirety of his electronic theft. The gems were portable, nearly untraceable, and easily converted back to cash later. He placed the diamonds into a simple money belt and fastened it under his clothes. Then he boarded a flight back to the United States, a walking fortune crossing the border. Honestly, U.S. Customs had no reason to suspect the nervous young man. The system had failed at every single point so far. Back in California, though, the first alarm bells finally rang. A routine audit at Security Pacific spotted the enormous, unauthorized transfer. Internal investigators were stunned. How could this happen? They traced the wire to the Swiss account, but that was a dead end. They had no idea who was behind the corporate alias. For a short while, Rifkin must have felt invincible. He was a multimillionaire. The crime seemed perfect. But then he made his first, and really his only, critical mistake. What do you do with millions in stolen diamonds you can't easily spend? He needed to convert some gems into spending money. He contacted a diamond broker in Los Angeles, posing as a lucky investor. He showed the broker a few small stones, testing the waters. The broker, however, became suspicious of the uncut gems and the young seller. This broker quietly alerted the authorities about the strange encounter. The information eventually reached the right ears at the Securities and Exchange Commission. The SEC and the FBI began to connect distant dots. They had a massive bank theft and a kid with unexplained diamonds. The pressure was building, but Rifkin didn't know it yet. He still felt secure, hidden behind his layers of deception. He even bragged about his intelligence to the wrong person. In a moment of overconfidence, he revealed the outline of his hack to an acquaintance. That acquaintance, troubled by the story, decided to go to the police. This gave investigators the missing piece: a name. Suddenly, the FBI had a prime suspect. They started surveilling Stanley Rifkin, watching his every move. They tracked him to a hotel near the airport. They listened, and they waited for the right moment to arrest him. But Rifkin was about to make another bold play. Sensing the walls closing in, he planned a desperate escape. He booked a flight out of the country, hoping to disappear. The FBI, however, was ready at the gate. They arrested him before he could board the plane. The 22-year-old who stole millions from his bedroom was finally in handcuffs. The diamonds were recovered, still tucked in his luggage. The story should have ended right there with a quick conviction. But the legal battle that followed was just as unconventional as the crime itself. Rifkin's defense wasn't to deny the theft, but to challenge its very definition. His lawyers argued this wasn't a traditional bank robbery at all. You see, the law at the time was written for physical takings, not digital ones. He didn't use a weapon or force, so was it really bank robbery? The prosecution, of course, argued that stealing millions is a crime, no matter the method. The case became a landmark test for the new digital age. Look, the courts had to decide if electronic digits were the same as cash in a vault. Rifkin was ultimately convicted of wire fraud and illegal computer access. He was sentenced to just 8 years in federal prison. But here's the part that really makes you think. He served only a fraction of that sentence before being paroled. And what did he do upon his release? He didn't fade into obscurity. He started a new business, offering his expertise as a security consultant. Can you believe the irony of that career shift? Companies actually hired the man who famously hacked them. He was selling advice on how to prevent the exact crime he had committed. Honestly, some saw him as a prophet of the coming computer age. He gave lectures, warning businesses about their own vulnerabilities. For a while, he was a living legend in certain circles. But the story doesn't end with a clean redemption arc. Old habits, as they say, are hard to break. In the 1990s, Rifkin found himself in legal trouble once again. He was accused of a new, sophisticated telemarketing fraud scheme. The familiar pattern of exploiting systemic trust had returned. He was convicted and sent back to prison. This second fall was somehow less shocking than the first. The brilliant hacker narrative was now tangled with a pattern of fraud. The Wall Street heist began to look less like a genius stunt and more like a symptom. So what was the real, lasting impact of his crime? It wasn't the recovered diamonds or the short prison term. The financial industry was forced to confront its own naive trust in technology. Security protocols for wire transfers were completely overhauled. The simple spoken code was abandoned forever. Multi-layer authentication became the absolute standard. Banks realized their employees were the weakest link in the chain. They implemented rigorous training and internal monitoring. The Rifkin case became a mandatory study in security textbooks. It was a cheap, painful lesson for the entire banking world. But here's a sobering thought. If a 22-year-old could do this with a payphone in 1978, what's possible today? The principles of social engineering he used are more relevant than ever. We still trust voices on the phone and codes in a system. The human element is always the hardest part to secure. Rifkin's legacy, for better or worse, is that he made that flaw undeniable. He exposed the gap between impressive technology and simple human procedure. And that gap is where every clever hacker still aims their attack. The diamonds he bought were eventually returned to Security Pacific Bank. But the bank's reputation took a hit that was harder to quantify. Customers wondered honestly if their money was truly safe in a digital world. Other financial institutions launched urgent internal reviews of their own systems. They found vulnerabilities they had never even considered before. Regulators stepped in, pushing for stricter federal guidelines on electronic transfers. The entire episode accelerated the development of more secure banking networks. Yet, for all the new rules, the core lesson was about perception. Rifkin succeeded because he looked and sounded like he was supposed to be there. He exploited the natural trust we place in routine and authority. So, was he a criminal mastermind or just a keen observer of human nature? His technical skills were almost secondary. His real tool was his understanding of how people follow procedures without question. After his second prison term, he largely faded from public view. The legend, however, continued to grow in the hacking community. He became a cautionary tale and an inspiration, which is a strange duality. Modern cybersecurity experts still reference the Rifkin method of social engineering. It's a classic case study in security awareness training even now. But let's rewind for a moment to the day of the theft itself. What was going through his mind as he stood at that payphone? Was it fear or a thrilling sense of power? We can only guess, because his motivations were never purely financial. Some psychologists suggested it was about the intellectual challenge, the game. The money and the diamonds were just the score. If that's true, then he won that game, at least for a little while. The system was his opponent, and he found the one move it couldn't counter. Then he got caught, not by a superior technology, but by human error. His own. He talked when he should have stayed silent. He got greedy for a normal life he couldn't have with stolen millions. That's the paradox at the heart of so many of these stories. The hack is perfect, but the hacker is all too human. They want to enjoy the rewards, and that's where the trail begins. Look at the aftermath for the people who worked at that wire transfer desk. Imagine being that operator who processed his fraudulent request. The personal guilt and professional shock must have been overwhelming. A single moment of trust, following standard protocol, led to a historic theft. How could you ever follow a procedure with full confidence again? The bank had to support its employees, while also overhauling everything they did. It was a managerial and a human resources nightmare. This single event changed career paths and corporate policies overnight. For the FBI agents on the case, it was a glimpse into a future type of crime. They had to learn about computers, digital transfers, and diamond markets all at once. It was a crash course in the 21st century happening in the late 1970s. Their successful investigation helped establish new forensic pathways. So, in a twisted way, Rifkin helped train the first generation of cybercrime investigators. The chase made both sides smarter. But let's be clear, that doesn't make him a hero. It makes him a catalyst, an accidental agent of change. The financial world erected stronger walls specifically because of him. And every new wall, of course, invites a new kind of climber. The arms race between security and intrusion had entered a new digital phase. Stanley Rifkin's name is etched right at the starting line. The psychological profile of a hacker like Rifkin is complex, but not uncommon. It often blends high intelligence with a certain social detachment. He saw the system as a puzzle to be solved, not as a trust to be upheld. This disconnect from the real-world consequences is a recurring theme. You have to ask, did he ever truly consider the people his theft would affect? The bank's shareholders, the employees, the customers, they were just abstract concepts. In his mind, he was outsmarting a machine, not harming individuals. That philosophical justification is a powerful enabler for digital crime. After all, if no one is physically hurt, does it feel as wrong? Honestly, the law had to scramble to answer that very question. His prosecution helped set precedents that are still referenced in cybercrime cases today. It established that electronic assets have the same legal value as physical ones. This seems obvious now, but it was a groundbreaking idea in the early 80s. The value wasn't in the paper or the coins, but in the data itself. Rifkin's conviction helped cement that principle into the legal framework. Now consider the sheer timeline of his crime from start to finish. The planning phase was measured in weeks, not months. The execution took just minutes on the phone. The escape to Switzerland and back took only days. And the spending phase, trying to sell the diamonds, was his immediate undoing. From perfect crime to arrest was a matter of a few short weeks. The window of his success was incredibly brief, but its shadow was very long. His story also highlights the odd geography of modern crime. The theft was orchestrated in Los Angeles. The money was sent to Zurich. The diamonds were purchased there. And he was arrested trying to flee from California. A global crime, executed before globalization was a common term. It proved that borders were meaningless to digital money. That revelation alone terrified regulators around the world. They realized they needed to cooperate internationally to track these flows. Agreements between banking authorities in different countries began to strengthen. So, what happened to the specific security flaw he exploited? The spoken authorization code was gone, but what replaced it? First came physical electronic devices that generated one-time codes. Then, later, biometric checks and multi-factor authentication on secure apps. Each layer was a direct response to the simplicity of past breaches. Every time you get a text message code to log into your bank, you see Rifkin's legacy. It's a small daily inconvenience born from a massive historic theft. He indirectly shaped the user experience for billions of people. That's a strange kind of immortality, isn't it? Now, let's talk about the money itself. $10 million in 1978 is equivalent to over $50 million today. It was an almost unimaginable sum for a young man to suddenly control. Yet, he never got to live a lavish lifestyle or spend it freely. The diamonds were a trophy, not a tool for enjoyment. He was caught before he could truly capitalize on his windfall. In the end, the financial gain from his crime was virtually zero. He traded years of his freedom for a brief feeling of intellectual superiority. When you frame it that way, the whole endeavor seems tragically pointless. But for students of crime and technology, it was far from pointless. It was an object lesson in the unforeseen vulnerabilities of progress. The banks were so proud of their new, fast electronic systems. They forgot that every new system creates new shadows. Rifkin simply walked into one of those shadows and helped himself. He was the ghost in the brand new machine. The final years of Stanley Rifkin's life are shrouded in quiet obscurity. He reportedly lived in California, far from the world of high finance he once disrupted. There were no more interviews, no more consulting gigs, no more lectures. The man who became a legend chose, or was forced into, a mundane existence. You have to wonder if he ever looked at modern cybersecurity with a sense of pride. Did he see the complex layers of protection as monuments to his own early work? Or was there just regret for a life path defined by that single brilliant mistake? We'll likely never know his private reflections. His story ends, not with a bang, but with a silent footnote of an ordinary death. He passed away in 2023, and the news was met with a brief, nostalgic ripple. Obituaries recapped the astonishing facts of the heist for a new generation. For many readers, it was the first time they'd ever heard his name, and that's the ultimate fate of most pioneers. They become a dusty reference. But let's pull back and look at the broader picture for a moment. Why does this particular story from the 1980s still captivate us? It's because it feels like a pure, almost fictional caper. It lacks the violence and darkness of so many other crime tales. It was a battle of wits, a young man against an impersonal giant. We can't help but admire the cleverness, even as we condemn the crime. There's a perverse thrill in watching the established order get fooled. Honestly, that's a tension that never gets old. The story also gives us a clear, clean before and after snapshot. Before Rifkin, banks trusted voice verification and simple codes. After Rifkin, that trust was systematically dismantled and rebuilt. He was a human catalyst for a technological evolution. So, what's the final takeaway lesson? It's that no system can ever be perfectly secure if humans are involved in running it. Procedures can be followed, and that very act of following can be exploited. The strongest firewall in the world can't stop a confident voice with the right information. That's as true today as it was in 1978. The methods are more complex, but the target is still human psychology. Rifkin's real theft wasn't the $10 million. It was the financial world's innocence. He stole the comfortable belief that new technology automatically meant better security. He forced an entire industry to grow up and think like a predator. In that sense, his impact was priceless. And that may be the most remarkable twist in this entire story. The millions were returned, the diamonds recovered, the hacker imprisoned. But the idea he planted, that the system is always hackable, that could never be put back. It's still out there, circulating in the digital ether. It inspires every security researcher trying to build stronger defenses. And it also inspires every new kid in a dorm room looking for a flaw. The game he started is still being played, on a global scale now. Stanley Mark Rifkin, the 22-year-old consultant, made his move decades ago. We're all just living in the response.